The consciousness that judges in this way is itself base because it divides up the action, producing and holding fast to the disparity of the action with itself. Further, it is hypocrisy because it passes off such judging not as another manner of being wicked, but as the correct consciousness of the action, setting itself up in this unreality and conceit of knowing well and better above the deeds it discredits and wanting its words without deeds to be taken for a superior kind of reality. By putting itself then in this way on a level with the doer on whom it passes judgment, it is recognized by the latter as the same as himself. This latter does not merely find himself apprehended by the other as something alien and disparate from it, but rather finds that other, according to its own nature and disposition, identical with himself. Perceiving this identity and giving utterance to it, he confesses this to the other and equally expects that the other, having in fact put himself on the same level, will also respond in words in which he will give utterance to this identity with him and expects that this mutual recognition will now exist in fact. His confession is not an abasement, a humiliation, a throwing away of himself in relation to the other, for this utterance is not a one-sided affair which would establish his disparity with the other. On the contrary, he gives himself utterance solely on account of his having seen his identity with the other. He, on his side, gives expression to their common identity in his confession, and gives utterance to it for the reason that language is the existence of spirit as an immediate self. He thereby expects that the other will contribute his part to this existence. Paragraph 666 continues this dialectic between what we can call the, at this point, judging consciousness, which is the universal consciousness. We've realized that this is not actually a universal consciousness, but rather a consciousness of the universal in the previous paragraph. That was an important transformation that took place. You could say it's a consciousness that speaks on behalf of the universal, that co-opts the universal, that takes it over. And we can call this the beautiful soul. We can also, as we saw last paragraph in 665, we can call it the valet, the kammerdiener, the chamber servant who looks at their master, the hero, not as a hero, but rather as somebody who's basically like the rest of us, but puts on airs or lives a privileged life or is, being given all sorts of, let's call it, prestige and passes, but really is just like the rest of us, eating and putting on clothes and picking their nose and doing all these base things. He's also called it the base consciousness, niederträchtige, right, pulling things downward. So we've got this judging consciousness on the one side, the one who is engaging in judgment and not acting, but just judging the action of the other consciousness, which we can call the acting individual consciousness. We can also, if we want to appropriate the discussion of the valet and the hero from the previous paragraph, we can say that this is actually the hero. This is a heroic or, to some degree, noble consciousness. Now, does that ring a bell? Thinking back in Spirit, did we have a dialectic between the noble and the base consciousness playing itself out? Yes, we did, in fact, in an earlier part of Spirit. In this case, the base consciousness, the judging consciousness, is the beautiful soul who says things and thereby thinks that they're doing something even though they're not really doing anything. And what's going on in this particular paragraph is a very interesting turning point that allows us to see the acting consciousness as possessing, or we might even say, to use one of the terms that Hegel's going to use here, expressing, performing a certain kind of nobility of character. And now notice here that nobility is not something that one has just within oneself. That's the way the beautiful soul thinks about itself, right? Oh, I'm so wonderful. Goodness is inside of me. The acting consciousness acts, and it does things that are, to some degree, good. They are fulfilling duty, flict, moral obligation, right? And we saw in the previous paragraph that any action that you take can be looked at in a number of different ways, right? There's a many-sidedness to action. Not only are actions complex by themselves, but you can also look at the motives of the action and judge them from a number of different perspectives, many of which would make the acting individual look evil, böse, look bad, look motivated by selfishness rather than by goodness. And what Hegel is doing here is setting us up for a couple things that are going to happen as we're concluding this section of Spirit. So one of these is the acting consciousness becoming aware of the judgment that is being made against them. Now, it could protest, as it did or as we would say, persist, beharren, right, as it did in previous paragraphs and say, no, I'm doing the right thing. I've got my own law inside of me. Who are you to judge me? At this point, it doesn't do that, though. At this point, it reaches out towards the other, and it says, well, you've actually got something right. You're actually on point in how you're judging me. And that's part of what makes it good, part of what makes it noble. We could even say that there's something like an aspect of duty to take into account the judgments of other people insofar as those judgments have any truth to them. And remember that for Hegel, truth is not a simplistic thing, right? So that's a lot of preamble to what's going on here. I do want to jump to the very end of this relatively short but very important and dense paragraph and talk about what's supposed to be happening but isn't actually happening. So you notice that I've got up here this reference to language as the existence of spirit, which is where this paragraph is ending. He says, he's telling us what this acting consciousness is doing, and says it gives utterance to it for the reason that language is the existence of spirit as an immediate self. And then it goes on, he therefore expects the other will contribute his part to this existence. So we're getting to, in the next couple paragraphs, a lot of discussion about the meaning and existence of spirit, of Geist, right? And this is, of course, the Phenomenology of Spirit, and this is the spirit section of the work, the longest portion of the work, with reason being the second longest. We're about to go into the religion section, so something should be happening here. We should be coming to a close and a conclusion about the nature of spirit. Hegel is telling us that spirit, Geist, again, has existence, Dasein, has being there within, we could say, the world, but not a world that's unpeopled. It's within a social world, a world of others. You know, the whole dialectic here has been dialectics of self-consciousnesses that are aiming at mutual recognition, which is not happening at this point, but really ought to be happening at this point. Going all the way back to the master-slave dialectic and the, two self-consciousnesses confronting each other and trying to have that struggle to the death and all these developments. What spirit has been looking for in the medium of us self-consciousnesses has been a mutual recognition, an anerkennen of each other, a knowing, a being cool with, a celebrating, however we want to put it, right? And that is being basically set up at this point, but it's going to fail at this point as well. And there's an important transition that's taking place here in an attitude or action, a kind of action, handeln, right, that is taking place on the part of the acting individual. And so they're not just acting, they're also doing something in the medium of language. Here, Sprache, right? And Hegel's using a couple different language words here. He uses the term Rede, discourse, right? Reden, actually, the verb turned into a noun. Language, Sprache. He's talking about expressing. This is all happening through the medium of engaging with the other linguistically. So it's not just thought on both sides. Judging consciousness, of course, is engaged in thinking. It's not just willing and acting on the part of the acting individual. It's also speaking with the other, communicating with the other, engaging in a kind of, hopefully, communion, but at least communicating. And that's happening through another C word, confession. C word in English, right? In German, Geständnis. Saying to the other, yeah, you've actually got something right. I'm not as good as I'd like to be. Your judgments of me, they might not be 100% accurate, but I feel them within me, the rightness, the truth that they do in fact possess. And I'm reflecting that back to you and saying, yeah, I am bad in some respects. My actions have not been as pure as one might pretend them to be. I do have motives that are selfish or that I need at least to examine. Maybe I'm not even sure what my motives are. You accused me in the previous paragraph of seeking fame because the things that I did actually made me famous. Maybe there's something to that. And so this is a reaching out to the other who is judging one. That's a tough thing to do, isn't it? And actually, before we go into the text itself, I want to say one other thing about this, especially as we're getting to the end of this spirit section, that I think a lot of people maybe forget as we're going through the phenomenology. And I'll probably need to reiterate this point as we get closer to the very end of the spirit section. The dialectic that is taking place is not one that is driven by necessity in the sense that everybody, once they reach a certain stage, must inevitably move on to the next stage. If you're at this shape of consciousness or this conflict of shapes of consciousness, you must then go down this path. Hegel is saying that's what's happened, but he's not saying that's what's happened in every case. It's possible to remain locked in here. It's possible for things to go off the path of the dialectic and then circle around and come back to some previous state of the dialectic and get stuck there. These are all possibilities. Hegel's not discussing that. He is narrating as a phenomenologist what is happening in this particular set of developments. So some people could stay stuck here forever, right? And they could stay stuck here forever in either side of this. So that's very important to keep in mind. One other proviso I need to get into. So you notice I've got here Gleichheit and Ungleichheit. These are terms that are being used in the German text, and we've talked about this quite a bit in other commentaries on other videos, other paragraphs, that Gleichheit can be equality, it can also be likeness, it can also be similarity, it can be, in this case, finding the other the same as oneself, right? It's establishing equivalence is another way. And then Ungleichheit is the opposite of that. Disparity is a way to translate it. Inequality, non-identity, these are all there. And they are all being mediated through language. Language is where these are coming to light. All right, so let's jump into the text now. So he says, the consciousness that judges in this way. Judges in what way? As the valet judging the hero. Everything we've seen in the previous paragraph. The judging consciousness, there's no action which it could not oppose to the universal aspect of the action, the personal aspect of the individuality, thereby playing the part of the moral valet towards the agent, the acting consciousness. So the consciousness that judges in this way is itself base, niederträchtigkeit, pulling things down, because it divides up the action. Right? It turns the action into what is being done, the motives for it, and these are made different from each other. And it's emphasizing the difference. This is a choice on the part of the judging consciousness. So he says it produces and holds fast to the disparity of the action with itself. So the action cannot be whole. The action cannot be an integral composite. Instead, there's moments of it that are being opposed to each other, at least in the thought and in the language of the judging consciousness. And that's something you can do with any action, really. I mean, at any point, we don't even have to be at this stage in the dialectic. Anybody can do that at any time. Plato pointed that out in talking about how any instance of justice, just turn it a little bit and you can find some injustice in it. That's an Ungleichheit. That's a disparity there, right? So he goes on and he says, further, it is hypocrisy. And we saw this before. The one who's accusing the other of hypocrisy is themselves a bigger hypocrite than the first hypocrite was. It's a hypocrisy because it passes off such judging not as another manner of being wicked, but as the correct consciousness of the action, right? It's saying that it has the correct consciousness of the action. It understands what's going on. And he says, setting itself up in this unreality and conceit of knowing well and better above the deeds it discredits, and wanting its words without deeds to be taken for a superior kind of reality. Now that's well worth lingering on, right? Hegel's using language here of like being on the same level, and if we want to think about this, the judging consciousness has actually placed itself on a higher level in its own mind than the acting consciousness, right? The universal is higher than the particular, we could say. But in reality, the acting consciousness is better in some respects than the judging consciousness. In what respects? Well, in that it engages with reality. It engages with actions. It wills. It acts. It behaves, right? Es handelt, we can say in German. It comports itself. And it doesn't just do so at one moment. It does so over and over again. It persists. It perseveres. It makes something of itself in its relation to the world and in its relation to others. It takes a risk. If we want to, play around a little bit, it existentially commits itself. Whereas this judging consciousness over here, it's got things very backwards, doesn't it? He says that, here we go, setting itself up in this unreality, Unwirklichkeit, and conceit of knowing well and better above the deeds that it's discrediting and that it's judging to be bad. And it wants its words without deeds, in this case, tatloses Reden, discoursing without doing anything, being all talk and no do, as we used to say. It wants this to be taken as the superior reality. Now, taken as the superior reality by who? Well, by itself. It's trying to convince itself of that. It also wants the acting consciousness to recognize that. And it wants the society, you could say, the larger matrix of others to the other and itself to acknowledge this as well. It wants spirit to take it seriously. And spirit won't take it seriously. This is one of the geniuses of Hegel. The recognition, and I don't mean recognition in honor canon, I mean recognition as in becoming aware of the fact that it's really on the side of the acting consciousness, the one who does, the one who risks, the one who particularizes and determines, and thereby, makes things real, wirklich. It's on that side that spirit lies, not just in a whole bunch of, ideas. Hegel's not an idealist in that sense. A lot of people paint him that way, but that's just because they're kind of lazy. they're not actually reading Hegel, or they're relying on sort of glosses that make themselves feel good, and they're like the judging consciousness of the guy Hegel who actually did the work to come up with these ideas. Let's go on. So he says, putting itself then in this way on a level with the doer on whom it passes judgment, it's recognized by the latter as the same as himself. So the judging consciousness is engaging in some sort of grasping of the acting individual, judging them, but the acting person is also grasping the judging consciousness. The judging consciousness is a self-consciousness which exists in relation to an other, and more is happening on the side of the acting consciousness. He says, here we go. This latter, the acting consciousness, does not merely find himself apprehended by the other as something alien, fremd, right, and disparate, ungleich, from it, but rather finds that other, according to its own nature and disposition, identical with itself. Now, this is a really interesting phrase here. So the judging consciousness is grasping the disparity between itself and the acting consciousness, but the acting consciousness finds the other to be the same as it, finds something of the other already in itself. We saw this before with the dialectic within the acting person of the individual and the universal within them. So this is how they can take the judgment and say, yeah, I guess maybe you're right about some of that. And, I'm going to reach out to you and take a double risk. I'm not only taking a risk by acting, I'm actually taking another risk by saying, yeah, man, you're right. So it finds the other the same, according to, as he says, its nature or disposition. And this is interesting because these are both translating the same term, Beschaffenheit. The way, when we talk about somebody being made a certain way, or I was born that way, and we talk about like temperament or orientation or stuff like that, that's kind of like what Hegel's talking about as Beschaffenheit here. Although I guess we could also think about how we make ourselves and how we're made by those around ourselves. So it's not a pure identity, that's the Gleichheit here, right? It's an identity of sameness, but also recognizing difference of how we are. So he says, perceiving this identity, giving utterance to it, right? So it perceives this identity with the other. It expresses or gives utterance to it. It speaks it out. He confesses this to the other and then equally expects. So this is not I'm going to confess and there's a power differential between us and I'm a miserable worm or something like that. It's actually being honest. It's being real. So he goes on and he says, he confesses this to the other and equally expects that the other, having in fact put himself on the same level, will also respond in words, medium of language, right, in which he will give utterance to this identity with him. And he expects that this mutual recognition will now exist in fact. There's a chance here to have mutual recognition, right? And so that's why this confession, which when we hear the word confession, we usually think about, legal stuff or we think about religious stuff. And either way, we're like, oh man, if you confess to the cops, you're in trouble, right? You're going away to the clink, and that's going to be a problem for you. Or we're like, oh, you're confessing to somebody else. I suppose we might also talk about it in other rhetorical forms as well. But it's usually like making oneself less by confessing. And this is one reason why people don't like to confess things, right? They don't like to be made less. Hegel specifies here that because there's this expectation that the other is going to reciprocate and thereby engage in recognition of the person who's confessing, that this is not a lowering of oneself. So he says that this utterance is, his confession is not an abasement, right? It's not a Erniedrigung, a lowering oneself. It's not a humiliation, Demutigung, right? It's not a oh, I'm so bad sort of confession, right? And he also says it's not a throwing away of himself in relation to the other. It's not a Wegwerfung in Verhältnis gegen das andere, right? So it's not throwing oneself away. It's actually putting oneself in front of the other in openness, in honesty, in an attempt to reach out to the other and to recognize the other and expect recognition in return. So this is a very powerful action. Not every acting consciousness will necessarily do that. Some of them might be like judging consciousness, so go screw yourself. I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and I don't care. Well, that's an earlier stage in this dialectical advancement. But it is possible. This is where responsibility comes in. This is very much an existentialist Hegel, is it not? I mean, this could be said by somebody like Simone de Beauvoir, all right, or Albert Camus. But it's being said by Hegel at this point. So he says, this utterance is not a one-sided affair which would establish disparity, again, Ungleichheit, with the other. On the contrary, he gives himself utterance solely on account of his having seen his identity with the other. He, on his side, gives expression to their common identity in his confession. Now here we come to the end. And gives utterance to it for the reason that language is the existence of spirit as an immediate self. He therefore, expects that the other will contribute his part to this existence of spirit, something bigger than both of them. When genuine confession in this sense is taking place, we might even use a different word for it, to describe this openness and honesty in relation to the other. This, here I am. I'm acting. I'm responsible for what I do. I invite you to do the same with me, in reciprocal recognition. That's creating something that's bigger than just the individuals themselves. And now this person over here on this side is like, okay, come on, your turn. And that's where the paragraph ends.